believe your own story has redemptive power. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and thanks for listening to the Parable Podcast. Joining me is my dear friend, founder of the Baton Pass, Kelly Olson, and my newest friend, strategic advisor member for the Baton Pass, Lindsay Boughton. Together, they share their own stories about surviving trauma and passing on hope to other women in their lives. Just as a trigger warning, both stories discuss sexual trauma, and if you have little ears around or you need to fast forward, I will put the timestamps in the show notes. I know you are going to be so blessed by what they are going to share today. Here's my conversation with Kelly Olson and Lindsay Boughton. Well, you know that stories matter to me. I hope that after you've listened to 100 plus episodes of the Parable Podcast, you know that stories matter and they have purpose and they have meaning. And sometimes we just never know what that is. So today I'm so excited to introduce you to Lindsay Boughton and Kelly Olson, both of the Baton Pass. They're dear friends of mine, and new and old. And we're going to just talk about these stories that have been shared through the Baton Pass over the years, connections that have been made, and hope that has really been passed. So ladies, thank you so much for joining me on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you, Danielle. We appreciate it.
I know we've done a couple collaboration episodes, and one of the things that I love most is the actual events where we get to see women one-on-one and connect with them, and we get to share these stories. And so, ladies, I'd love for you to kind of just share what has been a moment or something special within the last two events that you're like, gosh, this is why people come to these events. This is why we get to do what we get to do, and God has just really blessed this space that we're a part of. Kelly, why don't you go first?
I'll reference back to the breakthrough event that we hosted in November here in Chicago. Danielle, you were the host and MC, so thanks for being a big part of that. Mm-hmm. But as you hosted a panel of ladies talking about breaking through shame, fear, and isolation, we invited all the ladies that were there participating in the event and just coming to receive, have the opportunity to reflect on what they needed breakthrough in. And we put a list of potential things that women in their lives need breakthrough in. And we gave them some time to reflect and just pray and say, okay, what is it that I need breakthrough in? And we had these little terracotta plates that they were able to take some Sharpie markers and write down what that was. And then they went outside of the beautiful barn that we had the event at, and they could go and smash those terracotta plates. And just the release for so many of the ladies to be able to have that physical opportunity to release and to just surrender those things over to God and say, I want to break through this and I give it to you. And just to see those broken, shattered pieces was powerful. So grateful that I got to be a part of that and just to see the healing work that the Lord did through it.
I love that. I love the tangibleness of sometimes for every event that there's something that we can do. There's an action step. So anytime you can break a plate on purpose is pretty fun. I actually took a couple extra. Stacy, who is one of our team members, she's like, do you want to take these? And I'm like, I don't know when I'm going to need these next. So I took a couple.
I love
Lindsay,
it.
Yeah. Lindsay, what about you? What was something that stood out for you?
We were at the Muhammad launch, so the Central Illinois launch event. And one of the women said to me afterwards, she said, I love this. I love the idea of this. I'm so excited about this because if you free the women, you free the mamas, then their families are going to get freed. Mm-hmm. And that was really powerful and exactly what the mission of the Baton Pass is to, you just keep passing the baton as people are receiving hope, as God is redeeming stories and lives. You just pass the baton on further and further. Mm-hmm. And that was just really, really special.
That's so beautiful. Freedom. I love that. Kelly, you are the founder of the Baton Pass, and a lot of people might have heard your story all the way back in episode 4, but I'd love for you to kind of just recap that and share like what has happened in your world with the Baton Pass and where it's going.
So I'm so excited. Thank you, Danielle, so much for having Whitney on and Megan on earlier this spring and allowing them to share their stories. I appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you, and I'm so excited for Lindsay to get to share her story on this episode today. But for those of you that don't know the origin story of the Baton Pass, a few key elements of my story is that I grew up in a loving home. I was a straight A student. I was doing all the right things. And along the way, just made some decisions that put me in some uncomfortable places. And in my late teens, I walked through a very traumatic event. And I wish I could go back and tell myself, take it easy. You don't need another drink. I wish someone would have said to me, stay here with the group. You don't need to leave the club alone with him. And at the time, I just wrote it off. And I just thought it was just a night that I went too far due to the overconsumption and some blackouts along the way. I only remember pieces of that night, but I'll never forget how I felt afterwards. And I felt used and devalued. And the best one word that I could use to describe how I felt was disposable. And it was awful. And I wish I could go back and rewrite it. However, I just kept pushing forward. And I had the mindset that if I don't talk about it, then it won't affect me. But thank God that's not the end of my story. It wasn't until months after the trauma had happened that I began to realize that my body was not responding the way it used to, especially to physical touch or anybody's affection. And I would get startled and I would get triggered, and sometimes I'd even black out. But now with a greater understanding of trauma and its effects, I know it was just my body's way of trying to protect me and show me that there was deeper healing that needed to happen. At that point, though, unfortunately, I just kind of wrote it off and said, I guess this is just what I have to deal with, and I'll figure out how to cope. But I secretly wondered if I could ever be married. And my freshman year of college, I just cried out to the Lord. And I just said, I am struggling here alone and nobody knows the pain. Lord, please, Lord, help me find a path. That brokenness isn't the end of my story, that this is not the way that I will need to live the rest of my life. And there's a song by Elevation Worship called Trust in God. And I'm not a singer, but the lyrics say, I sought the Lord and he heard and he answered. And when I sing that song now, I just sang it in Arizona at church right before we had our Arizona event. And it just brought me to tears because that is the story that I want my daughters to know for the rest of their lives. That's the story that I want the closest friends to me. That's what I want everyone to know, is that when you seek the Lord, he hears your cries. And at the beginning, I thought my healing was going to come through counseling. But talk therapy without Christ at the center was just re-triggering for me. But by God's grace, I was able to hear the story of another woman that had walked through something very similar to what I had walked through. Her story sounded just like mine, but ended in healing and redemption. And the light in her story brought me out of darkness. My heart literally woke up again. And I was like, okay, coping isn't the best. I can truly be healed too. And I had renewed hope that my life could look differently. So that happened back in 2004. And this woman's story was the catalyst to my healing journey. God met me in such sweet ways and showed me step by step, breadcrumb by breadcrumb, what he was going to do to bring me to breakthrough and to ultimate healing. And I'm so grateful for that. In the next 10 years or so, God just put it on my heart that there was power in sharing stories, and that one woman's testimony could be another woman's prophecy. And in 2015, we bought the URL, the Baton Pass, because I had read a book about the baton exchange. And if you've overcome something difficult, then tell your story, because you can pass that baton of hope to somebody else. And in 2017, reluctant, not thinking that I was qualified or capable, we launched the Baton Pass with a handful of friends and my husband arm in arm with me. And it's just been an amazing journey since. The first event was in November of 2017. And since then, we've been hosting events here in Chicago. In 2021, we started hosting events in Phoenix, Arizona. And just this past February, we started hosting events in Central Illinois. And I'm just so grateful for Angela out in Phoenix and Whitney down in Central Illinois for their vision and their passion to continue to release the stories of women so that more hope can be restored. And I'm so grateful that Whitney recruited an amazing team of women down in Central Illinois. And so grateful that Lindsay is one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Kelly, one of the things that you said was, I think so many women just say, I just wrote that night off. I just thought, like, I'm just going to push this to the side. And that's just one thing of like how you've always expressed the Baton Pass. There are so many of us living in quiet desperation because we don't know what the next steps are. We haven't experienced trauma before, or we've never witnessed somebody walk through this. So we just kind of feel like we're in this space alone. And especially if you don't have God a part of your life, you're missing that connection of like what you just said, of when you walk through therapy, it just became triggering. There wasn't any purpose or understanding of how to fully heal, not just your body, but your soul. Thank you for walking us through and kind of a sneak peek of like where your story started and where it's continuing to go with the Baton Pass. Lindsay, you were a speaker at the last Baton Pass Chicago event, so I got to hear a little bit of your story, but you are the strategic advisory member for the Baton Pass, and you're in the Central Illinois area. So Lindsay, can you share with us a little bit about what your story and how that is connected to the Baton Pass?
Well, I grew up in a loving family, a story similar to Kelly's. I went to church. I was memorizing scripture from a young age, and I've lived enough life now to see that God's hand was always on me, whether or not I knew it or was really closely following. But I always saw, like, I can look back and see how God, his hand was actually on my life. When I went to college, I had a similar story as Kelly's, that I was sexually assaulted the very first weekend. I too had a couple drinks that, I just had never had anything to drink in high school. And it was the very first weekend. And I was trapped in this situation and couldn't get out. And I walked from that night just broken, sad, defeated, shamed, angry. And my response to that was just shut it down. I don't need to talk about this. I can move forward. Mostly because there was so much shame that I felt that I could have prevented this. I could have stopped drinking. I could have not gone there. There are all the things that you wish you would have done. But God was good, and he was calling to me instead of shaming me. And I actually had this kind of awakening moment in my dorm room, and where I knew God was there. And it was like he was telling me he was not only there in my dorm room right at that moment, but he was also in the room when I went through that horrible traumatic experience, that he didn't leave me, that he was there for me and with me. And he also showed me that I need to get to know him. Instead of this faith being on my parents or of church, it was like, no, he's drawing me into getting to know who he is. So that was September, and then November was when I felt like I had that real moment with God. And then in February of the next year, I went to a conference, and for the first time I heard, Jesus wants a relationship with you. And so instead of it being just do good, be good, follow the rules, Lindsay, you're a good kid, follow the rules. It was, Jesus wants a relationship with me. What? I felt like I had never heard that. And even if I had, it was like my ears were open for the first time during that conference. And so that was a very clear time that I said yes to following the Lord. About 4 years later, I was sitting in that same conference, and this is a large conference. I think there were probably 700 people there. And I remember sitting in the auditorium, and the room was dark, and there was loud praise music happening, 700 people singing, standing up, and I was sitting in the back and sitting. And I remember just praying, God, I just want you to heal me from this trauma. I want to be able to have a normal relationship with a guy. I want to be able to hug people because I hate it right now. I want to not flinch when someone touches my shoulder. And I remember just sitting there and just begging God, please free me from this. Just heal me, Lord. And then I heard, you are healed. I heard it, I knew it, and I chose to believe it. And from that moment on, it was like I really was free from it. And within 2 years, I was actually married. So I had a normal relationship, and so much so that I was able to get married, and so free that I remember sharing that story, which I don't like to share this story. It's vulnerable and it's hard, and it's not something I want to talk about. In fact, not that many people know about it in my life, but I decided to share the full story because they asked me to share your story, Lindsay, on a Sunday morning at a church in Urbana. And so I did. If I would share my story, I would usually talk with one other woman afterwards who would have been in a similar situation. So God always used that.
Gosh, Lindsay, thank you for that vulnerability. And it's interesting when you said, like, not many people know this story, because one, it's not like you're at a party and be like, let me just share this deep wounding.
Right.
This is a story that's meant to be shared with safe people that are able to truly listen and hear and hold that story well. So yeah, I'm sure that has been a journey for you, but I love what you said, that you felt God say you are healed and you chose to believe in that moment, because it's easy for, like, the way the world can portray us as victims, or, oh, she just doesn't have things together, or all these thoughts that go through our head. You knew, as because of your relationship with Jesus, that you were healed. It's so beautiful. Kelly, if we fast forward a little bit, this last year you turned 40. We were having a pool party, and I specifically remember you're like, guys, I have to tell you, like, what has been going on, because you were at a place where you were wondering, like, does the Baton Pass matter? Like, is the story about trauma? Like, is this all that it's going to be? So I'd love for you to kind of bring everybody to the pool party and share what you shared that day.
I had a big birthday. I don't have pool parties for every birthday. This was
you should
orchestrated. We should. This was orchestrated by my husband, and I had some of our dearest friends there. And I was just so excited to tell them about what had happened that week. Not only had I turned 40, but the day after my 40th birthday, I, as you referenced, was in a little bit of a wrestle with God. I was wrestling with the work that the Lord had asked me to do. And I was so grateful for everything that had happened with the Baton Pass already in 2023. We had just had a praise party and had 400 plus people there, got to share the stories of the Baton Pass. So you'd think I'd be so encouraged of all that God was doing. But the enemy was just kind of wedging it in to my side, telling me, like, this ministry is all built on a story that, just as Lindsay shared, you're not excited to share in most places. You're sharing it out of obedience, but really the trauma is hard and heavy. So on my way to the gym the morning after my birthday, I cried out to the Lord and I just said, Lord, I am kind of done with this trauma story. I really would like to see the Baton Pass thrive, but if I could stop telling my story, that would be great. And yeah, went in and did my workout, and a little bit later that morning got a text message. And I got a text message from Whitney, who is the director of Central Illinois, asking me if I knew the woman in this picture. And she texted me a picture of Lindsay, who I had not spoken to in 19 and a half years. I only remembered Lindsay's first name and therefore could not reconnect with her. And by God's grace, 2 times in my life did God use Lindsay to restore hope. In 2004, I was the girl in the back of the church that went up to Lindsay afterwards and said, can we get together? I need to know what you know, because I want to be healed like you've been healed. And she was so gracious. The thing that she did most for me back in 2004 was look into my eyes and say, if God can heal me, he can heal you too. And through just life, we weren't connected again until 19 and a half years later. And one of the things, Lindsay and I now talk every other week on a regular basis. And one of the things that the Lord has revealed to both of us is that he's not using our trauma stories I wouldn't have started the Baton Pass if there wasn't a Lindsay, if somebody didn't pass hope to me. But the Baton Pass was started because of the redemption story that God had written through Lindsay sharing her story. So Lindsay, I just want to say thank you. I jotted down a couple notes and then wanted to share something that I haven't calculated before, but wanted to share with you. When I think about the story of Joseph in the Bible, and that's it's just full of God's redemption, even when betrayal and the sin of others led Joseph into slavery in Egypt. In Genesis 50:20, it says, what the enemy meant for evil, God has turned around and used it for good and the saving of many lives. Mm-hmm. And Lindsay, because you passed that first baton, you were the first runner in this race. In 2017, 6 ladies shared their stories. 2018, 9 ladies shared their stories. In 2019, 8 ladies shared their stories. In 2020, we only had 4 ladies shared their stories. In 2021, 12 ladies shared their stories. In 2022, 14 women shared their stories. In 2023, 18 women shared their stories. In 2024, already 17 women have shared their stories, and 7 more will at the end of this month. So 24 total just in the first 4 months of 2024. When you total that up, by the time this episode airs, 95 women will have shared their stories at one of our events of God's redemption and hope because of your story, Lindsay. 1,052 different women have attended our events as well and have heard these stories of hope. We have only seen a sliver of what God has done through your initial story. But I just wanted to say thank you for your faithfulness, because I wouldn't have a redemption story without your testimony.
Okay, we'll just take a quick breather.
How do I come back with that?
Oh, gosh.
Wow.
That's so special. Lindsay, before you answer that, you guys had shared as you were preparing to express your stories together today, somebody had told you that this is an anointed story, and it truly is. It's miraculous. And just to be able to hear it, it gives me goosebumps every time. And sometimes we just don't know where this is going to go, where this is going to lead. Does this even matter? Are we going to see it on this side of heaven? So to experience this just as a bystander is just amazing to know that God is here. He's always been here, and he's going to continue to work. So what's your response as so many women, because we kind of just wonder, have you ever gone back and thought about Kelly in 2004 until she connected with Whitney and you got reconnected? Did you ever think about her?
The crazy thing, Danielle, I don't actually remember much about that meeting. In fact, Whitney showed me Kelly's picture. And actually, I would like to back up and tell you a little bit about what Whitney said when I was meeting with her. So Whitney and I are new friends. We just met in August of last year. We got together in September. We had met twice a year apart, and then thought, God's leading us. We really need to get together. This seems too crazy that we've seen each other several times now and we haven't got together. So I shared my story with her, which I don't usually share my story because of how personal it is. And, I feel so vulnerable, but Whitney has a way of drawing things out of people that you just can share. Well, as I'm sharing my story, and I got to the part about that I was at a church in Urbana, and her eyes got so big. She clasped her hands over her mouth and she said, "You're the Lindsay! You're the Lindsay!" And I said, "What are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about." And she just kept saying this. And I was like, I need more information. Well, she happened to be wearing a Baton Pass t-shirt. And she said, "I'm wearing this Baton Pass t-shirt because I wanted to ask you if you want to be part of this ministry. But you're the originator of it." And by then I was so confused. I had no idea what she was talking about. And then she shows me Kelly's picture, and I was like, what? Oh, I don't even remember her. And then as I left Whitney's, she goes, "I'm going to find this podcast and send it to you." It was one that Kelly had done in 2021. And the night before, she had remembered your name. Mm-hmm. So I left Whitney's, going on with life, and I started listening to that podcast, and it came back to me. I remember meeting this woman, and I remember the one thing that I said. And it was, if God can heal me, he can heal you too. That was it. That's what I remember from that conversation. Well, when I listened to that podcast, I sobbed and sobbed. And it was like the veil being torn, like you see heaven on earth and all of that. God has been doing all these redemption stories that are happening and you just have no idea. And it's literally something you think when you get to heaven, you'll see these kinds of things. And here I was listening to this podcast that Kelly is sharing her heart and they're talking about me, which was so weird. And I got to glimpse into heaven. And it was incredible. And I sobbed, and then I had to go to an orthodontist appointment for my son and pick him up and stop sobbing. And then I listened to it again. And and that afternoon, Kelly and I were actually able to connect.
Wow. What a ripple effect. And just to see how God uses it. And just, I love it that it takes sometimes just like small things, like just a brief reminder. And if you've never seen Whitney before, when you were sharing, like her eyes got big, she already has big eyes to begin with. So like, it's just, I can just imagine just being in that moment and just the sheer excitement that she probably had, just like unlocking that. So that's so beautiful. Kelly, I'd love for you to kind of share, has there been just little glimmers? Obviously, this is a huge only God moment where you're like, oh, wow, like I can't believe like this happened at this certain time, or like this extra moment happened that you could say, okay, this was only God.
Yeah, I think I need to toss this back to Lindsay to be able to share what transpired on our phone call that afternoon. Because as I talked to Lindsay, I was just so excited to have her back in my world. And we had a event in November planned. This was September. And I was like, well, if the original Baton Passer could be a speaker at this event. So we literally haven't talked in 19 and a half years, but I'm like, would you like to come up to Chicago and be part of this event? Because I couldn't think of anyone in the whole wide world that I would rather have come and share. But as we talked, God just drew more lines of connection and affirmation. But I'd love for you to share those, Lindsay.
So first off, I couldn't believe that Kelly was asking me. She just had talked to me after 19 years. And she's like, would you like to speak at this event? And I was like, that's some faith. You don't know where I've been, what I've been doing. That is some major faith. But I know Kelly, and I know she walks by the Spirit. So she wouldn't be asking if it wasn't something that she felt like God was leading her to. But she asked me, and I was telling her, I was like, yeah, this year, God gave me the word breakthrough in January, and he's really doing that. And there's just a number of things that have been happening. And I was, the past 7 years before 2023, I had this just series of just a lot of hardship, a lot of wilderness, barrenness. It was, one thing after another, with injury and sickness and death and anxiety, depression. There was addiction. I mean, there was just so much happening in our world. And in 2023, it was like, I was just broken. And when God said, this is the year of breakthrough, I, again, had to choose to believe that he's saying this. I'm going to choose to believe this is a year of breakthrough. And throughout the year, he showed me just all of these, it's like opening the door to what we were experiencing with our health. And then it was my husband, just depression lifted off of him, and had been for years, he'd been walking through this. And then this conversation with Kelly, I said, Kelly, my word of the year is breakthrough. And that is just God's using even this moment right now to break through, because I just thought I was done. Like, I thought ministry for me was done. My influence is done, and here she is stepping into this role, passing me the baton back and saying, hey, I want you to take it again. It's your turn. And when I said my word of the year is breakthrough, she goes, wait, say that again. I said, my word of the year is breakthrough. And she said, that's the name of our event in November, this breakthrough. And it was just another one of those only God moments that you can't plan that. You can't predict that.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Lindsay. I think when we kind of look back at our stories, or if people say, hey, you remember when you said this, you're kind of wondering like, oh, like, no, I don't remember that. Or like, why was that necessary? But it's just so beautiful how God uses certain pieces of our life to connect us back to others. And you were just even sharing with me earlier that you had been following the Baton Pass on Instagram since 2017. So like,
yes.
It's so funny how God has used so many things, and that like not until just recently this past year, God finally clicked all the pieces together. Was there anything else that came out of that for you as you felt like God wanted you to share at the last Baton Pass event?
Yeah, one of the key pieces of last year and just that breakthrough journey for me personally, I had taken a missions trip to Kenya, and it was my first missions trip. And while I was there, I had one of my frequent migraines, and I went up and kind of sat in the dark in a room by myself in the quiet, and I was just praying. And I felt like the Lord was saying, it is time to come out of hiding. And I remember that like, ugh. I'm found out, that really, do I have to step out into life again? Like, I kind of like this shelter that I've created. And even that next week, I was asked to share my story, and I did and it was rough. And I remember just like, I have like one little tiny bit of faith to get out there and start sharing it. And then when I was reintroduced to Kelly that afternoon, and she's asking me to speak, and it was just this whirlwind of like, oh, that's what God means when he's saying it's time to come out of hiding. This is a much bigger deal than just that toe in the water. He wants me to come out of hiding means you're no longer on your own terms, on your own way, doing your own thing anymore. I want you as I call you. And I didn't know what that looked like at the time. But one of the cool things that came out of just that conversation with Kelly and I was sharing the story with two of my friends. And honestly, I had no idea where they were in a relationship with God. Like I didn't know, but the story was so cool not to share that when I shared it with them, both of them said the same thing to me. They said, I want to know how to hear from God. And I was like, two people just said the same thing to me. I want to know how to hear from God. And since then, I have started a Thursday night, I call it Powerhouse Women's group. And we've been just inviting other women in to share their stories. And it's been really incredible just to see how God has used just the way Kelly and I were reunited and sharing stories. And then now God's propelling me forward and calling up other women to share stories. And it's been really a beautiful season.
How cool that it's just like a continuous use and just also just like a willingness, Lindsay. Like you said, you were in hiding for a bit, but when we say yes to what God wants to unlock, like it's so beautiful. Kelly, for you, like going forward, stories have power. We've learned that from this episode. What is your hope and your intention as women kind of want to unlock that for themselves? Is there anything coming up for the Baton Pass?
So I know that in a previous episode when you hosted Angela on the Parable podcast, Angela shared a little bit about Deployed and our virtual training program that helps women feel armed in their stories and deployed and sent to go share their stories. And that has been taking place for multiple years now, at least twice a year. And dozens of women have been able to find the fruitfulness in their stories so that they can ultimately find God in their stories, find greater healing, and share their stories in a way that is healing for them and empowering to others. I was actually on the phone this morning with a woman that went through Deployed just this last term, and just was so encouraged by the time that they spent and the resources that she gained through the course. And we have been really passionate about being able to give women that nudge of maybe I should share my story, but not knowing what the next steps are, tools and training to be able to do that. One of the ways that we're going to do that in the upcoming month on May 18th, we are partnering with Aubrey Sampson, who is a dear friend and partner of the Baton Pass. She has spoken at multiple Baton Pass events and is an author, a speaker, a podcaster, and has so eloquently shared her story in a way that empowers others in her books and as she is invited to conferences all over the country. And so she has been a trainer and a coach in my own life.
Yeah. Lindsay, as we wrap up, is there any final thoughts or maybe like just ways you want to encourage the woman who feels like maybe they're in hiding or their story is not one that they feel comfortable just sharing just yet? How would you encourage them?
I was thinking that God is always working behind the scenes. We don't know what's going on. We think that life is hard and grim, and whatever situation that we're walking through can be really just a sad part of our life or a traumatic part of our life, but we don't know what God's doing through that. We don't know what he's doing with the people we're sharing our stories with. We just don't know. And I think if anything, my biggest lesson from what I've learned of all this is that God's story of redemption is way bigger than we can ever think or imagine that it would be. And he wants to redeem my life. He wants to redeem your life. He wants to redeem those stories of darkness. He wants to bring us into the light and to give us a full life. And I love that. I love that this is just a story of redemption, but it's a story about passing on redemptive stories one after another and what God is doing there.
Yeah, so beautiful. Kelly, final thoughts as we end this time together. One, so thankful that I get to listen to this story. For women who are just like, what's next? I know like you were in that moment of like wondering like, is this all that it's going to be? So now that you've kind of launched, you've met Lindsay, you've connected, what does the future look like for the Baton Pass? What is your hope as it continues on?
My passion right now and in the next 5 years is to continue to create these sacred fortresses, these safe spaces where women can be connected and that they would know that they're not walking alone, so that whether it's past trauma or something that they're currently walking through or something that they will be facing, that they will not face it alone and that they will have somebody to be able to reach out to, that we would be such a culture of connection. Lindsay, as you were sharing what you're doing with your Thursday night crew, that's just a beautiful like extension of the Baton Pass. I want that happening everywhere. In addition to the large outreach events that we're hosting, I envision circle ups, which are our smaller gatherings, happening in all the major cities around the nation, regardless of where somebody pops up and needs community, that we can plug them in and that they wouldn't walk alone and that they would have women that can teach them how to hear God's voice, just like Lindsay is doing in Mahomet, Illinois.
Yeah, so good. Ladies, thanks so much for sharing your stories, your parable stories of how God has connected you and the redemptive work that he continues to do, even when we're not noticing through the years. So if you want to get connected to the Baton Pass, or if you have any more questions about this upcoming event with Aubrey Sampson, everything will be available in the show notes. Lindsay, Kelly, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast today.
Thank you, Danielle.
After we recorded, Lindsay went back and saw that she had been following the Baton Pass on Instagram since 2017. And unknowingly, Kelly said that she was one of the first followers, and neither of them knew who each other was. Then to later meet again in 2023 to come full circle. It is such a special and anointed story. If you want to connect, please check out all that the Baton Pass has to offer. Everything is listed in the show notes. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Lindsay and Kelly. Number 1, I'd love for you to reflect on who has been that person for you that went first, that shared their story. And if you are still in connection with them, please reach out and share that with them. That would mean the world to them, I'm sure. Number 2, is it time to come out of hiding with one of your stories? Maybe you weren't in that place yet. Maybe you didn't have safe people in your life, but maybe the time is now. If so, reflect, think about what and who you would like to share that story with. Thanks to my terrific producer of a husband, Eric, for making us sound so great today. That is going to do it. We're grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how you are never alone, how your story has power. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.